Hey everyone, welcome to our newest episode of You Only Go Once. I'm Cheryl Cantafio and I'm joined by my lovely co-host Eileen Grimes. And today we're here with a very lovely guest. Eileen, kick us off.
Jenny Lisk is an award-winning author and widowed mom who is dedicated to helping widowed parents increase their family's well-being. In her book, Future Widow, Jenny draws on her personal and professional experience to provide a real-life guide for surviving and thriving while raising grieving children. As host of the Widowed Parent podcast, Jenny has done more than 100 interviews with experts, seasoned widowed parents, and people who lost a parent at a young age. Her podcast brings much needed resources to parents, helping them feel less lost and alone. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Eileen and Cheryl. It's so great to be here.
For our listeners, I know Jenny, we met, what was it, a year? No,
It's
a year and a half ago.
Something like that. Yeah, it's been a while.
Goodness. But yeah, we were part of this group together of women authors. And I am so grateful to have met you and learned so much from you. And even, all the things that you're doing with your life and podcast and living on purpose. A lot of the things that you're doing are really on purpose. And I've admired that so greatly. And that's, part of the reason why we brought you here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's great to hear. It's I don't know, it's just been great getting to know you and hanging out. And you were over here on the other side of the mountains one time. We got to have coffee in person in real life. So that was awesome. So I'm really glad to be talking with you guys today.
Totally.
In the intro, we've kind of given away a little bit about something about your story, right? And the first question that we're going to ask is, have you had a moment or event that radically changed how you saw the world? And obviously, we had a little bit of foreshadowing with your intro. First of all, I'm very sorry for your loss.
Well, thank you.
How do you want to proceed in sharing your story and,
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about what happened?
Yeah, I'm happy to share my story because, I think as a widowed parent, I hear all the time people feel lost, right? And so I think by sharing my story, by other people sharing their stories, people who are widowed parents or younger widowed people can feel less alone, less lost, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's crazy. It was like 6 years ago right now. It was May of 2015. So it's coming up on, that'll be 8 years. My husband, Dennis, totally out of the blue, started feeling a little dizzy. And, dizzy, right? I don't know, maybe you're tired or dehydrated or, it doesn't seem like a big deal, right?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
But then I noticed these little subtle signs of confusion. And it was the weirdest thing, but it was mostly normal. So then I'm second guessing, right? Am I overthinking this? Am I imagining?
Yeah.
Did he really say, all these things? So I watched him over a period of about 2 weeks and he just got more and more confused. We ended up going into the doctor and somehow I thought it would be important for me to go with him. I didn't usually go with him to the doctor. Adults usually handle their own medical care unless it's a big, thing or whatever.
Yeah,
sure. I went with him and explaining this crazy things he'd been saying and thinking that it was this weird side effect of this medicine he'd started taking, completely unrelated. It was like a urinary thing. But I'd been Googling, right? Well, oh my God, what is going on? So I'm Googling. And one of the rare side effects of this medicine was confusion, cognitive, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was like, oh no, it's got to be that. We'll go in, we'll say, haha, isn't this funny? He'll change the medicine, we'll be all good. Well, like you said, Cheryl, we know the end of the story. He died. And what happened was, it turned out he had a very aggressive kind of brain cancer called glioblastoma. And it's like a single digit survival rate. It's super aggressive. And your listeners may have heard about it in the last few years. John McCain died of glioblastoma. And before that, Beau Biden died of glioblastoma. And he actually died right around the time my husband got sick and was having his first surgery. And at that time they just said brain cancer for Beau Biden. They didn't say which type, but I was reading about it and I'm like, I'm pretty sure it's the same kind.
Gotcha.
So he was sick for 8 months and we can talk as much or as little about that as you guys would like. I was his caregiver that whole time. Our kids were 8 and 10. And then by the time he died, they had birthdays. So they were now 9 and 11. And he died 7 years ago this month, actually, which is crazy to think about because I was just talking to somebody the other day and it's like, it feels like about 18 months ago and it feels like about 20 years ago.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just the weirdest sense of time. That's kind of how we got into this whole thing.
My goodness. There's so much. It's interesting. I was just having a conversation with somebody about my therapist. Again, sorry, listeners, talk about my therapist all the time. But there's these moments that happen in our lives. There's the before and then the after person, right? It's like this moment in time. When was that moment for you? Was it in that first visit that it hit you, or did it take time? The world shifted completely under your feet, I assume.
So yeah, so it shifted immediately. That first visit to primary care, right? Thinking it was going to be no big deal, and he says, let's do an MRI, and then he says, well, there's something really wrong with your brain. I don't want to scare you, but you have to go to the neurosurgeon tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I remember
Wow.
sitting in that primary care office on the little visitors, bench in the exam room, and closing my eyes and looking up at the ceiling and saying, are we really having this conversation? Like, is this a dream? Like, is this like, we're not really talking about this, are we? Because life had been so normal. Everything was just totally normal. And so everything shifted in that moment, but I don't think I went into like can-do mode.
Oh, totally.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, we're calling this doctor and we're having this surgery and we're doing this, and the kids need carpools, and we need meals, and we need this medicine, and this, like, everything, right?
Yeah.
And there was 8 months of dealing with multiple complications, and requiring repeat surgeries because the first one didn't heal up, and all these things, right?
Right.
And you could say on a macro level that the whole experience, you say, was anything that happened to you that shifted your perspective? Yeah, the whole experience shifted my perspective. And I could come back to a moment in my therapist's office next, but there was actually, within this whole period, there was one particular moment, interestingly, that shifted my perspective on one aspect. My good friend had told me that, she's like, you need to get him to write cards to your kids.
Oh,
right.
yeah.
She's like, like cards, like they can open one on their 16th birthday, and one on their 18th birthday, and one when they get married, and one when they graduate from something, whatever, right? All these. And I'm like, oh my God, that sounds awful, right? I'm like, that sounds like the worst idea in the world. But you know what? You're right.
Yeah.
Right. It's like,
Right.
all right, but how am I then it's like, okay, well, how am I going to do this? Because he was cognitively confused. So like I mentioned in the beginning, that he was somewhat confused. After his first surgery, he was never the same. It's kind of like I lost him twice. I lost who he was initially, and then I lost him altogether when he died. So I'm thinking, all right, he needs to write cards to the kids. How am I ever going to pull this off? No idea.
Right.
Kicking that idea around in my mind. One day he was staying in the hospital for one of his surgeries. I was home, planning on going over later that day to see him. He calls, and I remember I was making pancakes, right? Saturday morning. And he calls, and the phone, it's a strange number. I picked it up. Well, he didn't know how to work the phone at that point. He called, and I said something, and he said something about being confused. And he said, well, I guess that's just the way I am now. And I was like, ooh, right now he seems to have some awareness of what's going on. Like, all right, this is my chance. If I'm ever going to have a chance to write cards to the kids.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, all right. So I arranged places for the kids to go, because they were young enough. They needed to go someplace. I hopped in the car. I had to like swing into the big box store to buy cards. I didn't have cards, right?
Sure.
And you wouldn't believe how hard it is to find cards that are appropriate for men, that are not like birthday cards or wedding cards, right? Like I bought this set of cards, drive over there. I texted my friend, a friend of mine from college, so not the friend who told me about the cards, right? But a different friend whose then husband was also critically ill. And I texted her, and I remember walking into the hospital, like as we're talking, I can still remember this feeling of dread welling up at me, right? Parking in the parking garage, getting closer, getting in the elevator, going up the elevator. And I said, this is the hardest. Now, this is the only F-bomb in the book, so I won't say it here because you probably have a G rating on your podcast.
We don't.
Okay. This is the hardest F-bomb thing that I ever will have to do. As I'm walking into the hospital to tell him he's dying and that he has to write cards to the kids.
Yeah.
And then as the next, you get moved from the parking garage elevator to the other elevator, and I'm going up, and the dread level is rising.
Yeah.
All the way up to the 7th floor, whatever he was on. And so the end of the story is that I managed to get him to start one card to each kid. He wanted to finish them. And I was trying to get him to write like, love, Dad. He's like, no, I'll put it away later. I'll finish it later. So he didn't sign it off. And I knew he was never going to have a chance to do it again. And he didn't. Yeah. But anyway, when I texted my friend, I said, this is the hardest thing I'm ever going to have to do. And I realized nothing else is ever going to be so hard after this.
Yeah.
Giving a presentation at work to the executives who might yell at me, doing some other hard thing. If I can handle this, and I didn't want to handle it, but if I can handle walking into the hospital to tell my husband that he's dying and he has to write cards to the kids, nothing else is going to seem very hard after that. And that was a huge perspective shifting moment. Now, let me tell you, there was a point then when I almost forgot my own lesson. Right. So
Of
I was
course.
working a
Sure.
couple of years later, I was working several years later, I was working on the book,
Mhm.
the memoir about this time. And there was this part where I had to dig deep and find some more content and really think about how, if I wanted to share certain things. And I wrote to one of my colleagues who was endorsing the book, and she had read an early version. And I was like, and the listeners can't see, I'm typing like, frantically, right? Like, what am I going to say here? She writes back and she's like, well, I just read the part of the book where you said you could do hard things because you walked into the hospital. She's like, remember, you can do hard things. I'm like, oh, okay, you're right. Yes. All right. Thank you.
Right.
And then I dug deep and I added some stuff to the book, which, gave more context and was pretty vulnerable stuff. So that was, within the larger experience, I think that moment jumps out at me as a real perspective shifting moment within the experience.
Definitely. It's a struggle because it's when you see those big things, right? Some people experience it through different things, maybe their own self experiencing the passing of a loved one, or it could be their own close call with death or something along those lines. But gosh, I wish we could have that without having to go through some of these things.
I
But
know.
like, is it possible? I don't know.
I don't know, right? I mean, that's an interesting question. And I think that's one reason why people might read memoirs.
Sure.
Anybody's memoir, right? You learn. In fact, I don't know if you know Zibby Owens. She's a podcaster. She's a big book person. She likes to connect books to readers. And when I talked to her, she said she likes memoir because it's like sitting down with a friend for coffee, a friend who's going through some things. And you learn something from their life and their experience that you might apply to your own, even if their situation isn't exactly the same. But that's the thing about memoir. A memoir that's well done has some nuggets or some perspective shifting elements that you can see through the eyes of the character and then think about how that applies to yourself. And so I don't know, Eileen, it's a good question, right? Can we save people from, can we get them perspective shift without having to go through terrible things to get them? I don't know.
Yeah.
But, maybe various memoirs would be some places to consider starting.
Yeah. And so some of that too is, this is sort of what we're hoping for with the podcast, right? There's memoirs and things like that, but we're also like, let's hear some stories of people that are really like doing this. How can we take some of these lessons and apply them and do the scary things and try the hard stuff and really, really take a step back for 35 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever it is, and think about, well, I'm giving a presentation at work. Is it really like, what is the perspective on that? Maybe I've just listened to Jenny now and this really isn't that big of a deal. So like, that's sort of the goal with all of this conversation with different people is to help, I hope.
Yeah. Podcasts are great for that. And, and actually there was something else I was thinking of along these lines.
Yeah.
Sometime after my husband died, I had to think about, well, what's next for me? Right. Like he died. I didn't die.
Yeah.
Right. And I was 43. I remember thinking like he was 44. I remember thinking he got like half of a life. Right. I remember thinking this, if I kind of like half-assed the rest of my life, I kind of was going to be a doubly tragic situation. Like it's already tragic that he died and got half of his life. I'm still living, but I wanted to like live fully and figure out what that meant, not just exist. And so one of the things that I came across, I wish I remember where I came across this idea early on, but this idea that if you think about, so now this would have been like 2016 or something after he died. If I think forward 5 years, and I think if my life is still the same, if it looks, everything looks the same 5 years from now as it does today, would I be okay with that? And if you really ask yourself that question, would I be okay with that? And I was asking myself that, and I'm like, no, I wouldn't. So if the answer to that is no, or especially if the answer is hell no, right? Then now is the time to do something about that. Because in 5 years, a lot of things could change.
Absolutely. I mean, even if you're thinking externally, right? The world changes very quickly now.
Yeah.
So are you changing with it? Are you changing against it? Or like, what does that look like for you? And it's just such an interesting question. My answer is, God, I hope not. I hope I'm learning new things and being different, or not different, but just having the opportunity to see what's out there and how I can learn and adjust and experience the world in the way that it is. So I love that question, Jenny. That I'm gonna be posting. I think seriously, well, Cheryl knows this. I post stuff. I have my like vision board behind
Yep.
or like behind the computer so I can see
Yeah.
it every
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
I am going to be adding that question to my
Awesome.
board.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, it was a real perspective shifting question, right? Because
Yeah.
if you think about, well, maybe I should make some changes, or maybe I should do whatever. It's easy for day after day after week after week after month to just kind of slide by.
Right.
Right. But if you think about, future me, who's 5 years from now me, right? And what do I want that to look like? That framing helped me a lot.
Yeah, I'd imagine, I can't imagine, because this is, part of this is singularly your experience, right? We haven't, we haven't been the first person to lose somebody, but in your particular instance, it's like a gut punch, I would imagine. For you to kind of have that perspective is amazing. And I appreciate so much that you created this book for people to realize that you have to go on. You have to go on, because you were, I mean, I don't know, are his parents still alive?
His mother and stepfather and his family's here. Yeah.
Because I can't even imagine being sandwiched between having to tell your kids and having to tell his parents and your parents. What did your support system look like?
Oh, we could do a whole other podcast on that.
Okay.
I tell you.
Okay.
No, it's a really good question, and I'm happy to talk about it. But it's one of the things, and it's one of the things that I've noticed from, like, I had never been on this side of the fence of receiving all this support, right? Being in the position of the one that everybody is supporting.
Yeah.
And one of the things was I created a Caring Bridge online journal early on. Actually, my sister said we should do a Caring Bridge, and I was like, no, I don't want to do that. I'll just text some people some updates. And pretty quickly it became obvious that was just like copy pasting text all over the place. It was going to be ridiculous.
Can you let people know what Caring Bridge is, just in case they're not aware? Yeah
Absolutely. Caring Bridge is a wonderful tool. It's basically a free online blog for people who are going through a crisis, a death, a medical crisis, some kind of thing where you want to be able to update your, I'm going to use the word community loosely, like your friends and your neighbors, your family, people who want to support you and follow along. And so generally somebody will create it and say, this terrible thing happened and here's an update. And then they'll post another update tomorrow or whenever they want to post another update, and people can comment and support and stuff. And so I had been reading other people's Caring Bridges. I was familiar with it, but I didn't want to start one originally. And then my sister said, why don't we just do it? And so she made the first post with some basic facts. And then I pretty quickly took over. I was like, yeah, actually, I do want to share with the people who are supporting us what's happening. And I made a choice pretty early to kind of let people in as far as what was going on. In the beginning, it was more factual, like, he's out of surgery and this is how he's doing. Maybe he'll come home next week or whatever. Yeah. But as time went on, as 8 months went on, I got more and more reflective and spending time, like, I live on the east side of Seattle, so I would drive back and forth over the bridge to the hospital and have some quiet time to be thinking, like, what kind of update, like, what am I thinking about right now? And what kind of update do I want to do next? And sharing, kind of the journey in real time. And because of that, we were lucky enough to have a tremendous amount of support. People don't know what to do. Right. Yeah. And they don't want to intrude, and they don't want to, because I was sharing, people, I think it was easier for them to say, like, yeah, let me join the meal train. Yeah, let me help, your kids need carpools or the dogs need walking or things like that. And so I learned a lot about, like, who kind of gets it and who doesn't know what to say and doesn't say anything, and who, I learned how unhelpful that question, like, let me know if I can do anything to help, is. Like, and I've said that myself a million times, right? Because you don't want to assume what they need, and you don't know what they need, or maybe you don't even know them that well, or I don't know. And generally people, I think, are sincere when they say that. But what they don't, what I didn't realize before, and what people generally don't realize, is that the person is probably never going to call you, because and you're putting the burden on them. Like, I didn't know what I needed. Like, I needed help, but I didn't know what I needed. And so, like Eileen, if you said to me, well, let me know if you need anything. Well, now I'm like, okay, well, I don't know what kind of things Eileen might want to help with. And
the burden's on you.
And I don't know what I need. And, and even if somebody said, if you ever need me to go to Costco for you, well, I'm not going to call you and say,
Right.
You know, hey, can you go to Costco for me? Because I'm out of toilet paper. Because, you know, I'm thinking, well, you're probably taking your kids to soccer, and you're doing homework, or you're doing whatever, you're at your work, and you got your own stuff. But what was helpful was when my friend texted me and said, I'm at Costco right now. What do you need? And then I was like, oh, first of all, that's specific.
Yep.
Secondly, it's like, okay, I'm not imposing because she's there and I can say, oh my God, I need cat food and toilet paper. Can you please bring me those two things? Right.
Yeah.
So like things that are specific and concrete, I found were the most helpful. But I never would have realized that if I hadn't been on this side of receiving and witnessing all the different ways people tried to help or wanted to help, or, you know, all these things. So that was really an interesting aspect of it.
So another part of this too is obviously you have your kids, right?
Yep.
And they're grieving and going through this also. How were you able to support them through that, right? Because they wouldn't necessarily been able to tell you what they needed. So what did that look like for being able to support them in all of it?
Well, yeah, this is what I found to be the trickiest part, right? This is why I started a podcast for widowed parents, because I was like, okay, now I'm widowed. Now I have these two kids who are grieving. I found resources for myself.
Sure.
I'm not saying it was easy or any of these things, but I found good books. I found a therapist that I liked. There's actually a thing called Camp Widow. I don't know if you've heard of it, but if any of your listeners know anybody who's widowed, men and women, all Camp Widow, it's not camping, but it's like a conference for widows, basically. It's awesome. Anyway, campwidow.org, if you have show notes to put it in. I found that super supportive. I found stuff for myself, but I went to Amazon and I typed in, like, where's the book that's going to tell me how to be a widowed parent here? Yeah. And I wasn't finding anything. It's that I found was the trickiest thing. And one of the things that I wish I had known, so during the 8 months Dennis was sick, I was managing all the logistics of all of his medical care and all the emergencies. There was like 1 week when we went to the ER, like, I don't know, 5 times in the same week or something, 5 different ER visits in 1 week. Right. And the kids on one level were being taken care of. I had people that would take them to carpool to school and to sports practices, and people arranging school lunches, and people were bringing meals. Like the kids on that level were taken care of. If they needed someplace to go after school because I was at the hospital, there was somebody there for them. But what I didn't know, and even if I'd known, I don't know if I could have handled it, right? I had a lot on my plate. So it's one of the things where I'm definitely not beating myself up about it, because I did the best that I could. And also, I wish I had known how important it would have been to try to start some of those emotional discussions, for lack of a better word. Like, for example, there's the time when we were trying to play the children's board game, Sorry, for little kids. And because Dennis was confused, there was no bucket list stuff we were doing. There was none of that. We could watch TV. There wasn't much we could do, but we tried to play some little games. So we had, family game time. Now I'm doing air quotes here, right? Because it sounds exciting and it was terrible.
Right.
But so, Dennis, me, and then the two kids trying to play Sorry. So Megan, who was like 8 at the time, was coaching him through how to play the way that you would coach your little kid the first time you're teaching them how to play a board game. Oh, Dad, do you want to move your piece here? Oh, you got 4. You should move here. Oh, dude. And he's like, okay. And she moves a piece for him. Yeah. And I think on one level, I was just so glad that it kind of went well, quote unquote, right? Like nobody was crying. And we passed 30 minutes of time pleasantly enough, in a period of time when passing any time was always a chore. So the game went well enough. And I didn't say anything about the game ever again. Like it's like, okay, that's off my plate. Now we're going on to medicine or whatever we're doing. I wish I had known, because it must have been weird for Megan at 8 years old to be coaching her father in how to play the game Sorry. Right. Yeah. And she was so like cheerfully, supportively positive of him. And I so wish that I had known how helpful it would have been if I had revisited, maybe like that night when I was tucking her into bed. If I had said, oh, Megan, that was kind of weird today. How was that for you? And kind of open that door to the conversation on that level. Right. And if she had said, yeah, that was weird, we might have had a good conversation. If she had brushed it off and didn't want to talk about it, that's okay, because I'm still sending the message that the door is open to these conversations. So maybe next time she does want to talk about it, or maybe 6 months from now she wants to talk about it, right? And so things like that that like on that logistical level, the kids were quote unquote fine because they had people taking care of the things that other people could take care of. But nobody besides me could start opening those doors to the emotional aspects. And I wish I had started doing that sooner. And the other interesting part of this is that it's never too late. Now, this was 7 years ago. The Sorry game was maybe almost 8 years ago by now, just within the past 6 months. So Megan's now, she was 15 maybe. I was like, hey, Megan, remember the time we played Sorry when Dad was sick, blah, 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 blah. That was weird. She's like, yeah, it was.
Okay.
And I said, I wish I had known and we would have talked about it then. And so my point being, all these years later, it was still worth circling back and talking about it. But these are some of the things that I wish I had known and why I started the podcast, right? To go out and interview people and learn these things because I wasn't finding answers other places.
And I'm sure there were tidbits of things in so many different places, from all these people, and to actually be able to compile that and put it into one place, like what a gift for people to be able to have and listen to and learn from. Like it's just such an amazing thing to have.
Yeah, well, thank you. And because you're spot on, there are people doing excellent work in this space. And mostly they're doing discrete work in their own towns, right? There are grief centers in many communities. There's a great one in Portland called the Dougie Center, for example. And they're actually a national leader. But many towns, cities have grief centers. And if your kid goes to one of them, that's great, right? But like the kind of pulling together the cohesive picture of, I'm a new widowed parent. What am I supposed to do?
Right.
And that's what I wanted to start piecing together. So fortunately, like you said, since there are so many people doing this work, I've got a lot of people to interview, right?
Yeah, sure.
That I can call on and start to, draw out their best wisdom on all the different aspects.
I'm so grateful. One of the other things that I know, because we're talking about the kids side of things, you have this thing where we talk about grief support as like swimming lessons.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So can you explain that a little bit for folks?
Yeah. I've been hitting my head against the wall for 4 years trying to figure out how to piece all this together, right? And finally I was like, oh, grief support is like swimming lessons. Okay, what does that mean? Well, swimming, we teach kids as a proactive life skill. Being safe around the water is something that we just go ahead and start teaching our kids because it's a life skill that we don't wait until they're drowning and say, well, now let's give you some swimming lessons, right?
Right.
We help them with and there's probably lots of other skills, right, that we teach them to be ready for life. Well, grief support, healthy grieving, like one of the things that people I wondered, how do I know if we need, quote unquote, grief support? As if there was some threshold. If we're struggling this much, we need grief support. But if we're only struggling this much, well, then we don't need grief support, right? And how do you know where that line is? And I remember my neighbor said to me, oh, you should go to the grief center. And I was like, well, I don't know if we need that. But what I've come to realize with all the people I've talked to, all the reading I've done, all the stuff, is that there are these grief support programs for kids, and some of them have programs for parents too, where they teach and model healthy grieving skills and coping and remembering. And it turns out there's some tasks of mourning kind of that's, the thinkers who think about these things. So this guy named William Worden, who's a psychologist, came up with these tasks of mourning. And it has to do with like, accepting the reality of the loss is one of them. And one of them is about figuring out the place of the deceased person in your life as you're moving forward with your own life. Like, what role does this person? So it's not like, the old language of move on and you're not forgetting, but like, how do you remember this person and also carry forward with your own life? And what is that going to look like for you? And it might look different for each person, right? Yeah. And so it might involve, traditions or memories or pictures or candles or, some people talk with their person that died, out loud or in their heads or whatever. Whatever it is, the point being adjusting to this new world and figuring out how you're going forward with it. And so in the case of a kid right now, adjusting to this reality that their father or the mother has died. And what does this mean, right? And so these grief programs, my point is usually they have like groups for little kids and medium-sized kids and teenagers and young adults. And so with peer groups, learning some of these skills and starting to integrate this loss into their life in a healthy way that's, not stuffing it down and forgetting. Yeah. And also not being, stuck forever in a unfunctional situation. Yeah. And so the point is, we don't have to wait till the kid is struggling some certain amount to send them to a grief group. That I think it's just to say as a baseline, if a kid loses a parent or sibling they probably would benefit from going to a peer grief group. They might also need additional intervention. Some kids struggle more or have trauma or other, mental health things might develop or coexist, where they might also need more support. But the kind of general grief support isn't for necessarily kids who are struggling tremendously. It would be beneficial, I think, for any kids who have lost a parent.
Wow. I think it dives into a lot of the mental health side of things just in general within society, right? Where I feel like we're getting to that point, which is great and better, but it's not like, oh, I have to have dealt with, this thing before I can talk to somebody. We should just talk to people.
Right.
Like that should be a part of our baseline living, is having the opportunity to do that. And especially in times like this, to just have those tools, because our kids we haven't, and our kids haven't dealt with this before. So how do we provide those resources for them in a moment when life is really hard and we're just trying to figure out how to function generally, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. And you know what you're saying reminds me of, and this is again something I didn't know until I started learning about all this, that people will often say like, oh, you're struggling with this or that, you should see a therapist. Well, apparently you have to actually have a diagnosis for insurance to pay for a therapist.
Yeah.
So, if you have a diagnosis of anxiety or depression or this or this or this or that, then insurance will pay. Otherwise, you're paying big bucks.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of things that are not diagnosable according to the DSM, where somebody might be struggling or struggling even a lot, where talking with someone, a therapist, would be incredibly helpful. Yeah. But then you're stuck in a position where you're like, okay, well, I have to pay, I don't know, $300 an hour or something because my insurance isn't going to pay for it. Right. And so, by the way, somebody dying, your spouse dying, your parent dying as a child, isn't a DSM diagnosable condition. So unless you or your kid could be diagnosed with something, what? There's no support, right? You can't go to a therapist unless you can afford to pay out of pocket. Well, that's ridiculous. So the grief centers are not part of the medical model generally. And so some of them have low fees, some of them have sliding scale fees, some of them are entirely covered by donations. They're nonprofit and they run all their programs for free and they have to do fundraising to support it. But those are grief counselors, social workers who then can support the kids of the different ages and the adults sometimes too, outside that medical model of needing to have something that your insurance might pay for. And I was shocked when I heard about that. I was reading this study. I interviewed some people and I still have it right here. Okay, this thing has been on my desk. Now, listeners can't see. I'm pointing over here. I can't pull it out because my whole stack of books will fall over. There's highlights all over this thing. Highlight about this whole medical model, diagnosable, not diagnosable, and the implications of all this. And I'm like, oh my God, this is horrible, because somebody whose spouse dies or parent dies is probably going to be struggling and is probably going to need support. And we're just going to say, what? Oh, no therapist for you. Right? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's a lot to take in. I saw something a while ago, and Jenny had mentioned to you before we joined the podcast that my mom had passed away. And I had read an article just shortly before that about how people were debunking those different stages of grief, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because it's like, because it assumes like there's a process. It's like, you're in denial, and then you're bargaining, and then you're doing this, and then it's acceptance, and it's all,
right.
And then you should be better.
Right.
And it is so not the way that it happens. And I think you said it's been almost 7 years since your husband has passed, right?
We just had 7 years this month. Yep.
And I'm sure there's still moments where, you're still experiencing that, right? You're still experiencing the pain. I just find it so weird that I know the healthcare system to me is always bonkers anyway. And especially in these spaces. So you get a lot of support for hospice. You get a lot of support for when the person is dying. And then it seems like that's the end of the phase, right?
Right.
Have there been, I don't know how to word this properly because I don't want it to sound like a slight on the people who were there for you. I found that there have been people even now that have been checking in on me to make sure that I'm okay. Did you find that there was that same support structure for you and your kids? I mean, I know you said like the challenge was that you have these grieving centers, but there's also the people that are close to you, or you think that that they're close to you. Is there anybody that you would want to thank in this process for this, even after this time has passed?
Oh, well, I mean, every single person who supported us during, I mean, there's way too many to name, right? During I talked about the Caring Bridge Journal and all the people who supported us. I mean, all the people who brought all the meals, carpooled all the kids, brought wine or ice cream or York peppermint patties, who sent me a text and said, just thinking of you today, no need to respond, but I just wanted you to know I'm thinking about you. The woman who dropped a card in the mail, she was kind of an acquaintance at the time, maybe someone in our school community, maybe once a week, or every week and a half, maybe she'd drop a card in the mail, handwritten card, thinking of you. Sometimes she'd stick in a Starbucks card, say, get yourself a little treat when you're at the hospital because there's a Starbucks in the lobby. Just, a tremendous number of people. And I'm not going to name names. And the reason is because I did this in the eulogy that I gave. And I didn't mention a single name, but I mentioned people by role. And I said, you know who you are. If you did this, if you did this, and I remember saying, like, with the stress and pressure that I was under, I knew I would forget somebody. And I didn't want anybody to leave feeling that I didn't notice and appreciate what they had done. And it actually worked out very well. Like, I did a lot of brainstorming about all the different roles people had filled. And that was terrific. In terms of overall thanking, I was thinking about this. As I wrote this book, I had to write acknowledgements, which is an interesting challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there were a bunch of people I thanked, but 3 of them were 3 teachers that I had. And I thanked my first grade teacher, Diane Delacruz, my high school social studies teacher, Dennis Garrity, Dennis, same name as my husband, and my college political science professor, Sue Leeson. Diane Delacruz, the first grade teacher, is still in touch with our family, and she actually read the book and she texted me and she's like, oh my God, I didn't expect to see my name in the back of your book. So that was super nice. Sue Leeson, I remember I wrote in there, thank you for teaching me how to write concisely. College professor, taught constitutional law, and that, boy, every single word had to be concise. And I tell you, every single one of these 55,000 words in this book, it's like, it's an interesting exercise. And we're talking to my editor and I'm like, thank you for obsessing over every word in this book right along with me, right? And so I haven't been able to reach her because she went on to be a Oregon Supreme Court justice and all these things, and I don't know how to reach her.
Okay, sure.
And then my high school social studies teacher was the first person who noticed something special about my writing. And I, at that point, I was, okay, I can write, whatever, like, fine. It's, how you tend to discount the things that maybe you're skilled at.
Absolutely.
You think they're nothing special. Can't everybody do this or that, whatever, right? And I was like, whatever. And I remember him noticing and commenting, and he has since passed away. And so I'm not able to talk to him, but I wish I could, share this book with him.
It's amazing how many times teachers come up in that question.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
And just what a huge impact they make always, right? There's always one.
Yeah.
Everyone
and they
has
probably
one.
don't even know. Maybe they have some sense here and there, but you never know who's going to come back 5, 10, 20, 50 years later and say something you never knew.
Yeah.
Sure.
And it's the little things too. You're like, I didn't realize that passing comment was like the one thing that changed the way you saw the world or the way that you, took on the rest of your life.
Well, and the funny thing is, I remember the high school teacher saying, because I never raised my hand in class, he didn't know that I knew anything.
Sure.
And it was only when I started turning in papers, he was like, oh, interesting. So it was kind of a backhanded compliment, but but it made a huge impact.
All the work that you're doing is so incredible. We have one more question too that we go through. That's what's next. And I kind of have a sneak peek into that. So, but before we go into that, Jenny, where can people find you? Where can they find your book? If they're looking for resources and things like that, where can they find you?
Yeah, thank you. Everything I have can be found off my website, which is jennylisk.com, JENNYLISK.com. And I want to especially mention that I've put together a bunch of work for grief allies, the people who are supporting. We've had some really good discussion about that here, and I shared a few tips, but griefallies.com, I've got a ton of information. And I think especially with the pandemic now, everybody knows someone who's lost someone.
Yeah.
And I've tried to get really practical, like how to write a condolence card, which is like the worst task in the world, right? how to bring
Mhm.
food and not just bring a casserole, all these things. So griefallies.com. I think your listeners might find some resources there helpful.
That's great.
Fantastic. Are you on social media at all?
Of course. All the links are on my website. I'm Lisk
Great.
Jenny everywhere. And my podcast, the Widowed Parent Podcast, is on all the podcast platforms. My book, Future Widow, is everywhere you buy books, and links to all those things. If you just go to my website, you can get to anywhere you want to get.
So support Jenny. She's amazing. Book's amazing. Also, I know that there's an award for your first sentence, correct?
Yes, yes. That was the first award I won, actually, which was awesome. And it was especially gratifying because I probably spent 3 hours staring at the ceiling, writing, quote unquote, the first sentence. The first sentence is what, I don't know, a couple dozen words or something. And so it's interesting, the process, right? The first sentence and the closing are the parts I spent the most time on. So yeah, that was, but most books don't have awards, or most book awards contests don't have a best opening line category. So that was fun.
Thank you, Zibby.
Yes, that was from Zibby Owens, the Zibby Awards. Yeah. But I read, fortunately, I read somewhere, right? I was a new author. This is my first book, right? I have other books in the works. But, this question, if anybody was thinking about writing a book, right? Like, how do you put together a memoir?
Yeah.
Like, what makes a compelling story? And the interesting thing about memoir, which I didn't realize until I started looking into this, it has to be kind of written like fiction in terms of storytelling. You have to have a story arc. You have to draw people in. Your main character, who in this case I'm the narrator and I'm the main character. I have to have a story arc in the story, and so all those things. And I really didn't want the book to be like, this happened, the end, right? Because I'm like, that's not a book, that's just a retelling of events, right? So I'm like, how do I do this? And one of the most useful pieces of information I came across, speaking of having a vision board above your computer there, I had a sticky note above my computer the whole time I was writing the book. I heard Julie Lithcott-Hames, who's a New York Times bestselling parenting author, and she also wrote a memoir about growing up Black and biracial in America. And she said that memoir is an act of service.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, that's good. Stop that interview. Let me write that down, right? You're serving your reader. If your memoir doesn't in some way serve your reader, it's not an effective memoir. It's not something people want to read, right? Or maybe you're not writing it for the right reasons, right? Like, this isn't just, so yes, it's my story, but it's not just me. How can I be of service to the reader in the way I tell the story? How can I make the points that I'm trying to make, the themes that I'm trying to convey in the context of telling my story, yes, but in a more universal sort of way. So I wrote up, memoir as an act of service on this sticky note, Julie Lithcott-Hames, and I had it above, and every time I'm like, oh my God, why am I writing this book? This is too vulnerable. I should throw the whole thing out, right? I'm like, I look at that sticky note, okay, this is why I'm writing it. And then actually at the end, I sent her a thank you note, and I stuck the sticky note in the card and I mailed it to her.
Oh, that's great.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, see, we could keep going on and on and on for like another 3 hours here.
Yeah,
Totally.
this is...
So I know we're going way over, but yeah, so with all of your purpose, what is happening next? I know now that you're in this and really looking to serve others. What is happening next?
Yes, so the very next thing is going to be an anthology of tips from widowed parents to new widowed parents. And it's coming out later this year. It's called Widowed Parents Unite, 52 tips to get through the first year from one widowed parent to another. So look for that this year. And then I'm very excited. And actually, Eileen, I want to talk to you about children's books. Children's books. Yes, I'm working on, with my daughter is the illustrator. I'll have to show you some of the illustrations.
Oh,
yeah.
Most of them are top secret, but I'll show you guys some of them.
okay.
Children's books for grieving kids. It's a line of 24 books in the series based on the character traits in positive psychology. So I'm super excited about that. This is stuff that I wouldn't be doing if my husband hadn't died. And to say that sounds weird because it's not like, oh, yay, I'm doing exciting things because he died. It's like, no, he died. And I can't change that. And so now what am I going to do? Well, I'm really excited about these children's books. I'm really excited about this podcast. I'm really excited about talking to people like you guys and having these interesting in-depth discussions that I think hopefully will help, listeners with some perspectives or ideas or information or whatever. So yeah, long way of saying thank you for having me on. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Jenny. All right, everyone. This concludes our episode of You Only Go Once. And again, Jenny Lisk, thank you. Eileen, as always, it's a pleasure. And we'll see you next time. Take care.